Hi everyone. CNA is currently hiring, and I wanted to highlight a position for AI with AI listeners. Our enterprise, systems, and data analysis team is looking to hire a research specialist to conduct research into artificial intelligence and machine learning systems design. To learn more and apply for this position, visit the link in our show notes.
Welcome to AI with AI. That's Artificial Intelligence with Andy Lachinsky, a podcast from CNA Talks where we discuss the latest breakthroughs and implications in artificial intelligence and autonomy. And if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to check out our website where we will post all the links that we discussed today. That's cna.org/CAAI. Well, with that, Andy, we've got an exciting interview with Professor Ido Cantor from Bar-Ilan University talking about his latest research and discoveries in a new method or a new idea about how the brain actually learns and all the sort of ideas surrounding that. So that's very exciting. Everyone should stay tuned and listen to that really fun discussion. But first, what do we have for the latest and greatest in artificial intelligence and autonomy news?
All right, let's jump in. We have a couple of news items and then a really incredible model that DeepMind has dumped on everyone. Yeah. So we'll get to that in due course. So we start off with a kind of mopping up from a previous session. This is on podcast 5.12. So it was recorded not too long ago. We talked about the European Parliament's continuing debate about kind of AI and new regulations and the AI Act and so on. At that time, when we spoke earlier, we had mentioned that there was a pending vote. Well, that vote took place. And the final report of the European Parliament's Special Committee on AI in the digital age has been adopted. 495 votes to 34, 102 abstentions.
Not bad.
The AI Act itself is going to be voted on jointly by two committees, and that's late September. But this is kind of the interim vote. The other thing we'll post is at the time we talked about it on the earlier podcast, they had only released a draft version of the report. It's only like 30 pages or so. The final has been released. We'll provide a link to that. It's about 65 pages or so. There are no major changes there. The whole thrust is that, in the EU's opinion, that they should not regulate, or we should not regulate AI as a technology, and that it has, it poses obviously important ethical and legal questions, and there's lots of concern about military use, potential mass surveillance, and so on. There's no need to kind of retread old ground. It's roughly the same of what we've talked about, except now you can see the final form. And again, stay tuned for the full vote in September. All right. Exciting. On our side of the pond, AI news, on the 4th of May, the Department of Commerce launched, or hosted the launch, I should say, of the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee, which actually held its first formal meetings. We'll provide a link where you can look at I think it's like 2 hours long or so. So you can see a little bit of the deliberations. There's nothing earth-shattering except it is its first formal meeting, so you can basically see how things are going to be organized. For example, in the meeting, they stood up 5 working groups covering topics like leadership in trustworthy AI, leadership in research and development, supporting the U.S. workforce, and so on. It also formally established the Law Enforcement and AI Subcommittee, which will look at all things that you might imagine kind of make sense in that category: bias, security of data, adoptability of AI for security for law enforcement, and so on. To remind people, the advisory committee that was created in response to the National AI Initiative Act back in 2020. And the committee itself is administered by NIST. Stay tuned because we'll have another NIST story following.
Yeah, and it looks like the membership of the committee is pretty diverse with industry and other foundations and interest groups. So it looks like they have a good group of diverse and perspectives on that group.
Next story. You remember lots of discussion we've had on this podcast on brain-machine interfaces. And most of that discussion really revolved around Neuralink, right? How many times have we talked about that? Well, there's a New York-based company called Synchron, and it has beaten Elon Musk's Neuralink Corporation in the sense that this company is the first to have been granted FDA approval for U.S. clinical trials. So it beat him to the punch. To compare the two companies, by the way, Neuralink raised about $205 million last year. Synchron has raised about $70 million total. But it is, as of now, the first, as I say, FDA-approved clinical trial. So there's an interesting paper they published that appeared at the tail end of March that we'll provide a link to, where they talk about what essentially led to the FDA approval, where they had found that some test implants in 4 patients that had Lou Gehrig's disease showed no serious effects in a year-long study. And what makes this particular company or this particular interface unique, certainly compared to Neuralink, is where Neuralink's technology requires a direct implantation into the skull. Synchron's device does not. Once it's implanted, it actually travels to their brain through blood vessels, but it doesn't require any drilling into the skull or any kind of open brain surgery. So the first patient was already enrolled the first week in May, Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and we'll see what happens. But so kudos to Synchron. It beat Neuralink to the punch, and remarkable technology. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I'm curious to learn more about it because, right, as you just described, right, they basically drop it off in the jugular and it travels to the brain. I'm curious then how they replace it, or, you know, how they recharge it, or how any of that works, because it's much less accessible now to any sort of upgrades and that sort of thing. So I'd be very curious to learn more about Synchron's product here.
Very, very interesting. So before we get to the major research news of the week, which is DeepMind related, here's something that actually, it both took me by surprise and it didn't. We kind of live in a new era, and this is again in the context of large-scale language models. So, you know, a couple of years ago with the GPT-1, right, all the discussion we had, everybody, right? Should we release it? Should we not release it? It's dangerous. Well, the cat is out of the bag so many times. Well, on the 3rd of May, Meta AI has presented what it calls the Open Pre-trained Transformer, OPT. It's a large language model. It's very comparable to GPT-3 itself. And they show a couple of plots where, depending on how you look at it or slice it and dice it, there are differences, but its performance is essentially equivalent. In terms of size, it is very equivalent, has 175 billion parameters. And what the news is what Meta AI has done is it is literally given the research community the entire model, actually even more than that. It's given the OPT 175 billion parameter model. It's given the code base that it used to train and deploy it. It's releasing its logbook, which is kind of showing like an internal diary of what the research team did, daily updates literally on research as it was being conducted in real time, the infrastructure challenges that they faced in creating it. It's really a remarkable gift to the world. And this is, I don't have to say it, it's the first time that a fully trained, very large-scale language model, not just an API, I mean, that's the key, is now made available to any researcher who wants to study it. It's out there. So the debate as to what to release, when to release, how to release, although kudos to Meta AI for not just releasing it, that's remarkable on its own, but the entire, I'll just call it a diary, but it's a logbook of what was behind this. That's also available for anyone to examine.
I think it also kind of speaks to the marker that's been set from the idea of almost competition, right? In order to get people to use this thing, it's like yet another model of this size. Well, they have to do something a little bit more extraordinary. And that extraordinary step in this case, perhaps, is then to just simply make it available. So it'll be interesting to see what comes next. As you pointed, we've come a long way from the time of like, no, we can't even think about even releasing access to this thing to like, here, take the keys and everything.
Or to just wait on a waiting list like you and I are still doing.
Yeah, right? No,
there's no waiting list. Just go ahead and have fun as long as you have time and the resources.
Yeah.
So let's go into research. This is a biggie. I wish we had 2 hours to discuss not so much what it is, because it's easy to describe, but again, what it portends and the various discussions that have already started on Twitter, at the very least, as to what the ramifications are. So what am I talking about? On 12th of May, DeepMind released a system called Gato. It's a general purpose AI system. It's called, or the subtitle is Single Generalist Agent. And it's easy to describe because we've described the technology that sits underneath, except for what DeepMind did with it. And the technology is basically a transformer. Now, we know that from language models, right? You take little bits of text and then you apply the transformer architecture to it and you essentially predict in the context of what's been said, blah, 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 blah. You and I have talked on the podcast many times about various efforts, not just at DeepMind, but others, of taking that basic idea, but then asking, well, it works really well in language. Maybe it works in other things. And so it's been applied to images, for example. And it seems kind of counterintuitive, but demonstrably, it's a very powerful technique. And at the risk of oversimplifying, because the paper is very, very rich, it's about 40 or 50 pages long, and there's lots of meat in there. So I'll just be giving you the top level view. But imagine kind of taking that and just running with it. What do I mean by running with it? Apply the transformer idea to just about anything you can get your data hands on. So what Gato can do, and they show lots of really neat examples, it can engage in dialogue, it can caption images, it can stack blocks with a real robot arm, it can play Atari games, it can navigate 3D environments, and the list is almost endless. I mean, it's limited by the data they have. And the caveat in all of this, and this is in a very important way, a remarkable demonstration. The interesting things will be the philosophical discussions that stem from this. This is done with a single set of weights.
Right.
So the training is performed on a total set of something like a little over 600 total tasks, but they're distributed among a whole bunch of stuff: images, videos, robot motion, games, and so on. And in each of those cases, again, conceptually, if one can buy into the fact that the transformer idea is clearly generalizable from where it was born in the language domain to something like images, if you can buy into that, and there's good reason to, you can kind of buy into the fact, well, this makes perfect sense. Well, let's look at other types of data, right, that exist in the world that describe different aspects of the world. That's what Gato is. They have 3 different models, and they're fairly small. This is like a first demonstration, as it were, of this multimodal, multitasking, multi-embodied transformer approach to things. They have a 79 million parameter model. They have a 364 million parameter model, and their largest is 1.18 billion parameter model. That's vastly smaller than a GPT-3. So as you read the paper and you look at some of the statistics, not all of which are, as impressive as we're used to seeing, but for specific systems, right? That's the caveat. So among the good, they used it and they tested it on the arcade learning environment, that consists of like 50 or so Atari 2600 games. And Gato achieves average human or better scores for 23 of those games. It achieves over twice the human score for 11. I want to, again, emphasize, it's not trained exclusively on Atari. Right. In addition to doing that, so there's another test they put it to, the same exact set of weights. Nothing is different. It wasn't then retrained for this. This is the generic system. So there's a set of tests called Baby AI. It's for like following grounded language instructions. And among the published baselines for systems that target that, the typical scores are like between 77 and 90%. Gato, right off the bat, scores 75%. In a meta world where there are 50 robot manipulation tasks, Gato achieves more than 50% for all 44 out of 45 tasks. And the list goes on. I mean, it's very impressive. Now, on the downside, and you would expect there to be a downside because it is compared to the largest models we have that are dedicated to a given domain, it's much smaller.
Right.
And so indeed, the not so good, so while the scores for the Atari games, for example, can be seen as generically good, overall, the play obviously falls below that of most dedicated machine learning programs. That makes sense. Similarly, it has an ability to produce captions for images, and it does a serviceable job. Sometimes it gets it really bad, or it does a very poor job. Again, to be expected. There are a couple of other examples where they show its ability to chat with a human. And sometimes it gets very basic things wrong. Like, what's the capital of France? Well, Marseille, not so close. So there's the good and the bad. There are 2 points that I'm going to make. The basic idea behind it, the motivation certainly, is what would happen if we apply the transformer to all these other various domains. But on top of that, can we achieve anything that will kind of show that something truly interesting is happening vis-a-vis our march towards artificial general intelligence as the models are scaled? Now, right now, the model is too small. I think the jury is still out, but it's interesting that the researchers spent a little part of their paper showing a little bit of preliminary evidence where they compared their 3 different models. And there is a rudimentary scaling where they clearly do better as the model gets larger. The supposition, certainly from the research side, is, whoa, perhaps all we need is scaling. When we get to like a GPT-3 level and beyond, whoa, all of these multimodalities, they will magically somehow give us AGI, which is really the second point I want to make.
Yeah.
As you might imagine, people like Gary Marcus were all over this. But they had good reason. There is a remarkable quote that was tweeted by a researcher, Nando De Freitas. He's a machine learning professor at University of Oxford. He's also lead research scientist at DeepMind. And on the heels of Gato being released, and I'm quoting from two of his tweets. The first one is, "It's all about scale now!" Exclamation point. The game is over. The second one is even more remarkable. I'm quoting from the tweet by Nando De Freitas. "Solving these scaling challenges is what will deliver AGI." He goes on and says a couple of things. "Symbols are tools in the world, and big nets have no issue creating them and manipulating them." As I say, Gary Marcus has been all over this, and many others. It does put at the forefront, yet again, the issue of what do we mean by intelligence? What do we mean by artificial general intelligence? I will conclude my part, and I'm going to throw it into your lap in a second. Gary Marcus has a wonderful little essay that he put up not too long after this, where he suggests a new phraseology to kind of loosen our myopic focus on just AGI. And this is quoting from Gary Marcus's essay, and I'll stop here. Quote, "Alt intelligence isn't about building machines that solve problems in ways that have to do with human intelligence. It's about using massive amounts of data, often derived from human behavior, as a substitute for intelligence. Because what sits under the hood of Gato, as remarkable as it is, I'm not discounting it at all, clearly there is something fundamental about what the transformer architecture says about some part of the computational universe that our cognition is part of. That's undeniable. But is it artificial general intelligence? In my opinion, absolutely not. So I'll throw it back in your lap.
I think you've already encapsulated my view on this pretty well, which is the debate continues, right? It's not surprising to see people involved with this research claiming we've won, we got it. All we need to do is just bump up bigger numbers and bigger, and we'll get there. And to see Gary come in and say, whoa, hold on, not so fast there. What I do think is interesting and perhaps different about the conversation, at least what I've seen from this small snapshot, is maybe a way to change the discussion a little. And that idea of, okay, we talk about AGI in this sort of amorphic way that we think we all know what it means, but we really don't. But our approach so far is now perhaps this idea of throwing lots of information at something or lots of data. It doesn't have to actually even be correct information, whatever that means. And then we're going to use that as a substitute for whatever we're going to call intelligence. That is an interesting conversation, and I will be curious to see how that discussion thread starts to evolve, because if now you can say that we're calling this something different because it's a different type of behavior, it's a different type of intelligence, then that allows us maybe to have more of a productive conversation about what we're doing and where we're heading. But again, I think we'll continue to see this debate go on. I'll just be interested to see how the dialogue between these types of parties continues.
Yeah, but fascinating system.
Yeah.
So to conclude this part of the podcast, again, stay tuned for the interview with two quick call-outs. The first one bears directly on what we just talked about. It's a piece that was published in the New York Times by Steve Johnson. The name should sound familiar. He's a very prolific author. He's published over a dozen books. One of my favorites that he published a while ago called Emergence, The Connected Lives of Ants, Brains, Cities, and Software. Well, he published basically a thought piece in the New York Times in the middle of April. And the title of the piece is AI is Mastering Language. Should we trust what it says? This was before Gato came out, but it is a fairly long, it's a non-technical kind of a sweeping history of GPT-3 in the context of other efforts. Talks about Google's pre-Palm large language model. Remember, we talked about Palm not too long ago. And it has lots of interesting little insights, little stories. As I say, it's a history really of the development of GPT-3. Lots of examples, some of which I hadn't seen before. So it's just a nice companion piece to what we just talked about. It's a very nicely written essay. And to conclude very quickly, the magazine of the week is Daedalus. The spring 2022 issue just came out, the title of which is AI and Society. It really is a mini book. I mean, it's close to 400 pages. It's got essays that kind of span the gamut by some people that most of you should know. Eric Schmidt has a nice little essay in there. There are a couple of others. I failed in my attempt to get a physical copy. I tried 2 or 3 Barnes and Nobles, but for some reason they just don't stock it. I mean, I thought this was a magazine that was readily available. But in any case, Daedalus makes it freely available on their website, so you can download the 384 PDF. It is very much worth perusing. Lots of really fascinating essays on AI and society. And that'll conclude this part of the podcast.
All right, thanks, Andy. And stay tuned. We'll be back after a short break with Professor Ido Cantor to discuss the latest in his neuroscience research.
My name's Kaya Haney, and I'm a member of the team behind CNA's Inclusive National Security Event Series. As a listener of this podcast, I know that you're well aware of the benefits and challenges presented by artificial intelligence. An upcoming event will explore these issues, thinking about the implications of AI bias for national security and what can be done to prevent structural and systemic biases from being reproduced in algorithms. This virtual event will take place on June 7th at 12 p.m. and you can RSVP by clicking the link in the show notes or by emailing us at inclusivenatsec@cna.org.
Well, Andy, we have another special guest with us for this podcast, Professor Ido Cantor from the Gonda Multidisciplinary Brain Research Center at Bar-Ilan University. Professor Cantor, we're very excited to discuss your research. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is my pleasure and honor to talk with you today.
Well, thank you again so much for being here. Now, over the last 5 years of recording this podcast, we've covered a number of research topics that involve neuroscience. And we often discuss the interplay between neuroscience and machine learning, where discoveries in one field feed back into the other. So what's so exciting about Professor Cantor's work, which builds on many years of experiments, is that the results suggest a new mechanism for brain learning involving neural dendritic trees. So Professor, perhaps we can start there. What is this new mechanism for neural learning?
Okay, maybe first let me introduce myself. I'm a physicist and a computer scientist in my education and a professor at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. I'm experienced not only in neuroscience, but in models of disordered magnetic systems, ultra-fast physical random number generators, theory of neural networks, and synchronization among neurons and lasers, documented in many publications. I had a very unusual transition in my scientific career after having been a full professor in theoretical physics for 2 decades and one of the pioneers in bridging between statistical mechanics and learning theory. 9 years ago, I became an experimentalist and opened my own wet lab in neuroscience where we manipulate neuronal cultures. I followed the teaching of my supervisor during my postdoc at Princeton University, and Nobel laureate, late Professor Phil Anderson, Follow Your Dreams. So now you can understand the unusual transition from theoretical physics to experimental neuroscience. Maybe I will start now to explain our work, if it is okay with you.
That would be perfect. Thank you.
Let me start from neuroscience. Synaptic plasticity is a long-lasting core hypothesis of brain learning that suggests local adaptation between 2 connecting neurons and forms the foundation of machine learning. The main complexity of synaptic plasticity is that synapses and dendrites connect neurons in series, and existing experiments cannot pinpoint the significant imprinted or irreversible adaptation location. The second complexity is that synaptic plasticity is a very slow and noisy adaptation process which typically lasts tens of minutes and occurs far from the computational element, the spiking soma. For illustration, assume that the CPU is placed at the lobby of a skyscraper and the disk at the roof of the skyscraper, where the speed of information transfer is not the speed of light, but only few meters per second. The third complexity of synaptic plasticity is a time lags among influx stimulations of the soma, via different synapses and are critical parameters that control adaptation process. However, these time lags are a function of the history of neuronal activity and fluctuate and vary dynamically. Hence, the reproducibility of the same output for the same input of the neuron is in question. On the other hand, dendritic adaptation is fast and can take a few seconds only. It occurs closer to the soma, and it is effectively a global learning process, since changing the strength of the trunk of the dendritic tree is equivalent to changes of all its leaves, the synapses. Now, since learning mainly occurs in different sites of our brain, in the dendrites instead of the synapses, this finding should direct new types of treatment for degenerative diseases such as Alzheimer. The new demonstration of efficient learning on dendritic trees calls for a new approach in brain research, but also for generation of counterpart hardware aiming to implement advanced AI algorithms.
Yeah, let me jump right in there. So, kind of take us back to when you first started doing the experiments that led to dendritic learning. What's the motivation? And it sounds very intuitive, right? But the way you describe it by analogy, it seems kind of silly almost, right? That nature would kind of take the CPU, I think is used the example, right?
Yeah.
The soma, and just that vast distance, surely something must be going on. But that's my question to you. So, was that your original motivation? And then you were devising a series of experiments to kind of just put hypotheses to the test. It does seem reasonable. The other question along with that is, why haven't other people thought of this? Before you answer,
Yeah.
one of the things that struck me when Dave and I were talking about your earlier work that was published in January, there was a remarkable statement you made in that work where you said, essentially what you had discovered and continue discovering, it could have been discovered using 1980s technology.
I agree.
But the conventional wisdom took such great root, right? And it happens in other fields that nobody saw it. It's kind of in plain sight. So again, bring us back to that moment where, if there was one, or the original motivation. How did these experiments, where did they come from? And what originally motivated you? Or was it literally what you just described and you just set out to explore it?
Let me first answer your first question. So, learning in neuroscience, I believe, is one of the unique events in the history of science during the last century in the following aspect. At first, the assumption of synaptic plasticity was rooted in the community since the hypothesis of Donald Hebb in 1949, and only many years later experimental evidence was gathered to support this hypothesis, the story I call it, and not vice versa. If today one can examine the experimental evidence to support synaptic plasticity without the assumption, the immediate conclusion will be that the support is in question. But what helped to screen this problematic rooted assumption is its link to the development of machine learning and especially AI. However, today it is clear that the mutual influence between adaptation in neuroscience and machine learning is very weak, if any, and the two disciplines diverge from each other almost from the early stage. So I believe this is my answer to your first question.
Now, the later on in your paper, or at the tail end, you use as a test bed kind of a standard. It's called the MNIST, the handwritten digit data set. And again, it's a remarkable demonstration. A single neuron, essentially, right? It can implement a multi-layer network. That's a remarkable demonstration. I mean, what's the response been from the AI and machine learning community? Have you been besieged by emails saying, "Whoa, Ido, what's up here? You got to help us out"?
I understand first the reaction of neuroscience community, and I believe your question is now more in the sociology of science, in particular neuroscience. So the sociology of neuroscience is evident. It is hard for all of us and for scientists to declare that the main hypothesis or premise of his or her work over decades is wrong. However, this part of scientific evolution, and I am sure there are brave leading neuroscientists who will soon confirm in independent experiments the existence of dendritic learning and the features of the new neuron. It is doable with existing state-of-the-art facilities. But let me comment, we reached our conclusions using a new experimental setup, but in principle this result could have been discovered using technologies that has existed since the 80s. The belief that has been rooted in the scientific world over 100 years result in this delay of several decades. In physics, which is my second hat, when a new phenomenon is experimentally reported, immediately other groups are trying to confirm and to generalize. I expected neuroscientists around me to tell me, Ido, you don't know nothing of fundamental facts in neuroscience, but silence. Long silence, ignored my work and returned to do the same things they did over years. Now, I understand the reaction of high-impact journals which rejected my submitted papers over and over without a peer review, because it is almost impossible to find reviewers to support such publications.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Without a peer review?
Yeah.
So you sent in?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Without a peer review, send it to more specialized journals and so on.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
However, I believe and trust a change is coming, and at least opinion articles will be written on dendritic learning. I can add that all my individual research grant proposals were rejected during the last 10 years. And it came to a situation where I couldn't continue my research, but at the last minute I found partial support. So it's not easy to do such a research which is in contradiction with the community.
Well, having published in Physical Review E,
Yeah.
it certainly behooves the neuroscience community to read, understand, reproduce, and just move forward with your work, because it's demonstrable.
Yeah, you ask me, how I came to this idea. So let me start with my teenager. When I was a teenager, I read about Copernicus, and who was the first to say loudly that the Earth revolves around the Sun and not vice versa. And indeed, all accumulated astronomical evidence at that time fit the old postulation. However, the simplest trajectory of the Sun and planets became more and more complicated. I guess something is wrong, Copernicus said to himself. I said to myself, I've always admired Copernicus, one of the, I believe, scientific lighthouses of swimming against the stream when scientific evidence tell you something is wrong. I don't have the cleverness of Copernicus, but I have always admired Copernicus. Now, since I wear now two hats as a physicist and neuroscientist, I was not satisfied with the assumption of synaptic plasticity suggested by Donald Hebb in 1949. This assumption is becoming so deeply rooted in the scientific community, but the logic seems to be reversed, as I explained before. Finding fundamental rules is a primary goal, and only later must more complex networks and tasks be investigated. Moreover, synaptic plasticity was introduced to quantitatively explain learning capabilities, but the interplay between adaptation in neuroscience and learning is still ambiguous in neuroscience. So I have told my students several years ago the assumption about brain learning and functionalities seems to be wrong. And this issue was the main motivation for the very unusual transition in my scientific career from theoretical physics to experimental neuroscience. And I must say, swimming against the stream is very difficult, and now I understand. I understand.
Literally today in the journal Entropy, which I don't know how well known it is, but Richard Soleil from the Santa Fe Institute, that I'm sure you know, he just published a wonderful survey of kind of the open issues and problems on the evolution of brains and computers. And one of the main points he makes, it's a visionary paper, but your main thread is kind of underscored of the three main points that I remember from Soleil's paper, which is, and this is the point being made, that the dynamical patterns exhibited, as Soleil argues and lays out in the paper, by living systems, and this is a quote from his paper, seldom appear in artificial neural nets And he gives many, many examples, not yours, because he probably wasn't even aware of the work, but it is something that, at least from the complex systems community, which is where Richard Soleil comes from, there's more than a little bit of resonance. I hope that will help and further the research that you're doing. Certainly, there's a growing awareness of the need for a deeper understanding of processes. That's a fascinating story you've given. A couple of other questions that only an expert such as yourself can answer, a little bit outside of what you're doing directly, but related to the whole notion of brain as a computational system. There has been a notion more than a decade long, probably longer than that the brain itself as a global computational mechanism is kind of in a self-organized critical state. So I'll throw that to you in a second. And the other question being that there have been many to question kind of the fundamentals as the basis of your own research of the computational role. And the question is there one for glial cells? They're non-neuronal for our listeners, but they're located, tell me if I'm wrong, within the central nervous system. They presumably provide like metabolic support for neurons. But there have been lots of speculation that maybe they actually play a computational role. Again, these are questions from left field. I don't mean to put you in a corner, but because you're an expert and motivated so much by let's question the conventional wisdom. So brain is self-organized critical state and the possible computational role for glial cells. And any comments?
I have a little knowledge, let's say, in statistical mechanics, as I said, self-organized criticality and so on. They are some global behavior of system at the critical point. And we are looking for dynamical properties on a very short time scale, So I'm not in favor of looking for power laws and other global measurements in neural networks, let's say. So again, I have some papers about it that I also was against this notion of power law, because any decreasing function, if you plot the activity versus rank order, you find a decreasing rank function, and if you plot it on a log-log scale, you can approximate it by a power law. But if you look carefully on the data, it's not a power law, and one should look for the origin of this power law in such a system. Another difference between physical system and biological systems, that in physical system always we neglect, or not always, but almost always we neglect the delay. And in the brain, delays are very important. So if you look on simulations in physics, so always they put the degrees of freedom on a lattice, and then they start to make simulations where the delay is basically zero or the same for all the degrees of freedom. But in the brain, we know we have integrated and fire elements, and we have delays, and the delays varies much among neurons, and even in the same neuron as a function of time, for instance, due to the neuronal response latency, which can change the dynamic significantly.
So, Ido, now what can we be looking for with the application of this research that you've been doing to machine learning?
Okay, so traditionally machine learning technique stems from the dynamics of human brain. However, these two scenarios are intrinsically different. The main reason is that the backpropagation procedure, the main technique used in AI, is biologically implausible, as it changes a weight in a non-local manner. The number of routes between an output unit and the weight is very large via many convolutional and fully connected hidden layers, and the enormous transportation of precise weight information via all these routes can be performed effectively using fast parallel GPUs, which enable fast product of matrices and vectors. However, they are evidently beyond biological realization. Learning on dendritic trees, in contrast, where each weight is connected to an output unit via only one route only, represent a step towards a plausible biological realization of a backpropagation technique. In addition, a dendrite functions as a nonlinear amplifier. its nonlinear amplification practically generates an exponential number of input crosses. An input crosses stands for a product of several inputs which serves as an input to such a weight. These input crosses enhance success rates, but their number can be huge, such as Avogadro number. And direct implementation of a large number of cross weights independently is beyond existing and anticipated computational power. Hence, a new type of nonlinear adaptive dendritic hardware for imitating dendritic learning and estimating the computational capability of the brain must be built. And to summarize, the clock of the brain is 1 Hz or even slower, and the dynamics is very noisy. However, in many perceptual tasks, our performance is even superior to gigahertz computers based on parallel processor and GPUs. Think about the capability of AI based on 1 Hz or even 1 kilohertz CPUs. Hence, if one can implement slow brain dynamics on ultra-fast computers, the sky could be the limit.
That's quite a vision there. That we should all ponder that. That's a remarkable story. Is there a part of your lab that will be developing or trying to develop some machine learning algorithms based on these ideas?
Part of my students are working in the wet lab, but now most of them are working on simulations and theory. And I believe we will come with new results. If you look on brain dynamics, is really different than the solution of AI. And if today you slow down the clock of AI algorithms, then basically we can forget about AI. And the question is, what is the hidden secrets beyond the speed of our computers?
Mm-hmm.
So we are working also on theoretical and, let's say, pure AI problems, not for applications, but on basic aspects of AI algorithms.
All right, Professor Cantor, we really appreciate the discussion today. You've got some fascinating work. And of course, we're looking forward to hearing what the scientific community's reaction is as well. And we look forward to hearing about more of your research in the future. So thank you so much for being here. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, well, if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to check out our website where we will post all the links that we discussed today. That's cna.org/CAAI. But I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords. Thanks as always, Andy. I'll see you next time.
Sounds good.